Welcome back to The Dark Silent. Tonight we journey back in time, not to a realm of fiction, but to a very real nightmare that unfolded on the streets of Victorian London. In 1888, London was the heart of the largest empire the world had ever known, a glittering hub of industry, finance and power. But this beating heart had a dark, festering underside, a place where the shadows were deeper, the fog was thicker, and human life was terrifyingly cheap. From this abyss of poverty and despair, a figure would emerge, a human predator who, for one blood-drenched autumn, would hold the entire city hostage to fear. He was a phantom, a butcher, and a ghost who melted back into the smog from which he came. He was never caught, his motives were never known, and his identity remains the most profound mystery in the annals of crime. He left behind only butchered bodies and a name he chose for himself, a name that would echo for eternity. Jack the Ripper. The terror of Jack the Ripper lies not in what we know, but in everything we don't. He is the faceless man in the dark, the embodiment of a nameless threat. His story is more than a simple true crime tale. It is a foundational myth of the modern city, a warning that even in the midst of civilization, a monster can operate with impunity, taunt his pursuers, and vanish without a trace. The question of his identity has haunted generations, not just because the case is unsolved, but because the answer could be anyone. To begin to comprehend the monster, we must first step into his world. We must walk the labyrinthine streets of his chosen hunting ground, the London district of Whitechapel, in 1888. Forget any romantic notions of Victorian England. This place was a circle of hell on earth. It was the desperate, chaotic dumping ground for the city's poor, a cacophony of gin palaces, brothels and squalid lodging houses where thousands were crammed into conditions of unimaginable filth and deprivation. In Whitechapel, life was a brutal daily struggle for survival. For the women at the very bottom of this social ladder, known euphemistically as unfortunates, the struggle was even more desperate. Cast out by society and family, plagued by alcoholism and illness, their only means of earning the few pennies needed for a bed and a piece of bread was to sell themselves on the street. They were utterly vulnerable, living without protection, their disappearances and deaths often going unnoticed and unmourned by the wider world. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, a cart driver on his way to work in a dark lane called Bucks Row saw a bundle lying on the ground. It was the body of 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly. Polly had been a mother of 5, whose life had unraveled into alcoholism and poverty after her marriage failed. That night she had been turned out of her lodging house for lack of 4pence. The examining surgeon found her throat had been severed by 2 clean, savage cuts. But the greater horror lay hidden beneath her clothes. Her abdomen had been viciously mutilated. The first move had been made, but London did not yet know a deadly game had begun. Just 8 days later, on September 8th, the killer's boldness and brutality escalated. In the pre-dawn hours, in the backyard of a lodging house on Hanbury Street, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered. Annie, aged 47, had also fallen on hard times, a respectable coachman's widow whose grief had led her to drink and the streets. The Ripper's attack on her was more ferocious. Not only was her throat cut with savage force, but her abdomen had been laid open entirely. The killer had then performed a gruesome act of surgery. He had excised her uterus with a chilling degree of skill and taken it with him. Panic began to grip the East End. This was no common criminal, this was a hunter collecting trophies. The night of September 30th would cement the Ripper's legend in a storm of unprecedented violence. Around 1 a.m., in a dark alley called Dutfield's Yard, the body of Elizabeth Stride was found. Elizabeth, a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant, was a familiar face in the area, known for her quiet and harmless nature. Her throat was slashed, the blood still fresh, indicating she had been killed just moments before the discovery. Crucially, there were no other mutilations. The police theorized the killer had been interrupted, but he was not finished. His bloodlust was now at a fever pitch. Less than 1 hour later, and barely a mile away in Mitre Square, a policeman on his beat discovered the second victim of the night, Catherine Eddowes. Catherine, 46, had been in police custody for public drunkenness earlier that evening. and was released just before she crossed paths with the killer. The scene was one of absolute horror. The killer, having been denied his ritual with stride, unleashed a frenzy of violence on Eddowes. Her face was deliberately mutilated, her body ripped open, and both her left kidney and her uterus had been removed. In the space of an hour, the Ripper had killed 2 women in 2 different police jurisdictions and vanished into the night. The city was now drowning in fear, and the killer decided to give them a name to fear. A letter written in red ink and filled with mocking bravado was sent to the Central News Agency. It began, "Dear Boss," and in it, the author bragged about his crimes. He signed it with the name that would make him immortal: Jack the Ripper. Days later, a postcard followed, referencing the double event. Then came the most chilling correspondence of all. A package addressed to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside was a small box containing half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. The accompanying note began with the words, "From Hell," and the author claimed to have fried and eaten the other half. The kidney was later medically examined and deemed consistent with the one taken from Catherine Eddowes. For over a month, an eerie silence fell. Then on November 9th, Jack the Ripper performed his horrifying finale. The victim was Mary Jane Kelly, a 25-year-old woman who was much younger and considered more attractive than the others. Unlike the previous murders, this one took place indoors in the privacy of her small room at 13 Miller's Court. With hours to work undisturbed, the killer unleashed a level of savagery that defies description. When the door was finally broken down, the scene was so gruesome that even hardened police officers were traumatized. The young woman on the bed was virtually unidentifiable as human. It was an act of total annihilation. And after that final, deafening crescendo of violence, the Ripper was never heard from again. The police investigation was the largest in London's history, but it was doomed from the start. In an age before forensic science, they had little to go on. They conducted house-to-house inquiries, interviewed thousands, and followed countless false leads. Witness descriptions were vague and contradictory. Some saw a man in a deerstalker hat, others a man carrying a black bag. The killer was a ghost, leaving behind no fingerprints, no reliable sightings, just a trail of blood and terror that grew colder with each passing day. In the absence of proof, a vast and varied list of suspects has accumulated over the century. There was Montague John Druitt, a barrister from a good family whose body was found in the Thames shortly after the last murder, leading the chief of police to believe he was the man. There was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish hairdresser living in the heart of Whitechapel, who was a prime police suspect suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and a hatred for women. There was George Chapman, another Polish immigrant, who was later hanged for poisoning 3 of his wives. The lead inspector on the case went to his grave convinced Chapman was the Ripper. The theories grew wilder over time. Some pointed to Dr. Francis Tumblety, an eccentric American quack doctor who was arrested on a minor charge but fled the country and who was known to have a collection of anatomical specimens. Others have suggested a woman, a Jill the Ripper, perhaps a midwife who could walk the streets covered in blood without suspicion. The most elaborate theories involve a grand conspiracy reaching up to the royal family itself. Each suspect is a compelling ghost story in their own right, but none have ever been definitively proven to be the man. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The panic slowly subsided, but the scars on the city's psyche remained. The case of Jack the Ripper served as a brutal wake-up call, exposing the horrific conditions of the urban poor and highlighting the desperate need for social reform and more sophisticated policing techniques. The Ripper, in his own monstrous way, helped to drag London into the 20th century. In the end, the identity of Jack the Ripper is lost to the fogs of history, and perhaps that is why he endures. He is not a man, but a shape in the darkness, not a person, but a question mark carved in blood. He represents the ultimate horror, the evil that comes from nowhere, performs its terrible work and returns to nowhere, leaving us to stare into the abyss, wondering what other monsters walk among us, hidden behind ordinary faces, waiting for their own dark autumn to begin. Thank you for joining us in the shadows. Until next time.